let's talk about two other things, because you mentioned the eyewitnesses in the neighborhood on the timeline. So loosely, the timeline by the prosecution was that morning by 10:30, she was missing. And Scott had left to go to either golfing or the marina, as he later changed his story to, and that's, in fact, where he was. There was an issue about the dog, because the dog was found running around in the neighborhood with its leash on. I think you and I believe, and the prosecution argued, I believe, Scott let the dog out. It was like, this is part of creating his story, that somebody got her, somebody abducted her in broad daylight on Christmas Eve, and they're walking around their neighborhood. And there was a question about what time the dog was returned by a well-meaning female neighbor who found the dog, knew it was the Petersons, and opened up their gate and put the dog back into the backyard as a good Samaritan. And if it was early, I'm trying to remember how it went down, but basically there's a mailman who is saying that when he dropped off the mail, the dog wasn't there. And he came a little later in the morning. And he always got barked at by the dog. But this day, when he dropped off the mail around 10:30, there was no barking. He doesn't believe the dog had been returned to the neighborhood. And therefore, Lacey must have been out walking the dog at 10:30. This is the defense theory. And therefore, Scott could not have committed this murder because Scott was already gone. The defense wants Scott gone as early in the day as possible, and Lacey running into trouble as late in the morning as possible, so that Scott couldn't have done it. And they want to rely on this mailman as proof the dog had not yet been lost or returned to the backyard. If the listening audience could just see Matt's face, it's worth watching this on YouTube just so you can see his facial reactions.
Sorry, I'm not. This is why I'm terrible at poker. Yeah,
not into it.
It's there's any irregularity. We're talking about human beings, and we're talking about the frailty of human recollection. First of all, so everything is an estimate. I mean, you see your neighbor's dog.
Can't reopen a case on that.
Well, you shouldn't be reopening a case on that. And we're talking 20 years later, and it's like, oh yeah, I think I got there on my route, about 10:30 based on the following. But also there's so much inherent speculation and supposition, like, well, the dog usually would bark at me, and I don't remember it barking that day. But the thing is also there's an instruction regarding circumstantial evidence, and it's two reasonable interpretations. Okay, so that there's an instruction that every jury is provided about whether there's one reasonable interpretation or two, one pointing towards innocence, one pointing towards guilt. And the problem is that when you have to jump through a million different speculative hoops about, so the mailman remembers the dog barking. Okay, good. But that's also consistent completely with the idea that the dog got out when he's loaded his dead wife into the boat, and somehow he leaves a gate or the garage open long enough for the dog to get outside, and leaving at 9:30. And that just means the dog is running around the neighborhood at the time. That is not one of those things that you can say, aha, it's totally. Well,
and by the way, if your dog's not barking, it could mean your dog has found a bone. Your dog has found something more interesting than the mailman. Could be anything.
Your dog is asleep. Or the dog just got out when he left at 9:30, and the mailman comes and the dog's not barking because it hasn't been returned yet, because the neighbor doesn't remember exactly when she did it.
Well, the other thing is, to your point, Matt, when I was a young lawyer myself, I practiced law with this very smart woman, and she told me this amazing story about when she was in law school. At the time, she was a nurse. She wound up pursuing law later in her life. And her teacher came in late one day. Her professor, a law school professor, came in late one day, was all huffing and puffing. Sorry, I'm so late. There was like crazy incident on the road. Almost got run off the road, like a road rage situation, but sorry, I'm fine. 2 minutes later, the guy with whom he had the road rage confrontation comes banging on the door to the classroom. And the teacher's like, whoa. And the students are like, whoa. And the guy comes in and starts threatening the professor. And everybody's like, oh my God, and draws a gun. And the professor's like, oh my God. So he runs and the guy runs after him. And it's great because my friend Sandy, who was, like some people are good in a panic situation and some people aren't. And it was like a George Costanza thing, the way she explained. There were all these big burly men who ran for the door. Like they didn't want any part of this. They weren't going to protect any of the people who were exposed in the classroom. And then there's Sandy, my very small boned nurse, who was like, get the guy in the wheelchair away from the door right now. You barricade the door. You make sure whatever. It's like she took control. Of course, you know where this is going because you're a prosecutor.
Of course.
10 minutes later, 5 minutes later, the professor comes back into the classroom. He's totally fine. And he admits to the class that this was an exercise. And he says, take out a piece of paper and a pen. And all I want you to do is write down a description of the man. And they were all over the board. One person said he was in a neon orange jacket. One said he was wearing all black. One said he had shorts on. One said he had full body pants and arms covered. And of course, the whole exercise was an attempt to show how unreliable eyewitness testimony is, especially when there's any sort of adrenaline involved or high stakes involved.
100%. Right. So the example that we would always give for in explaining that concept to a jury is if a clown came running through the courtroom and bopped somebody on the head with a rubber hammer. Some people might remember the red floppy shoes. Some might remember the fuzzy buttons. But if somebody didn't remember one of those things, it doesn't mean if the issue is what was the clown wearing, it's very important. If the issue is did somebody come in and get bop somebody on the head with a hammer, if that's what the jury if that's their task to figure out that happened, then those types of details don't matter. And the adrenaline in that situation, there's a whole other thing called weapons focus, where I guarantee half that class got everything wrong because they were just wide-eyed at the gun. So that's a great exercise. You probably couldn't do that in law school today because everybody would get sued for the trauma, right? And I can tell you, again, from personal experience, it's funny that you say nurse because we used to joke about this. Nurses are the best prosecution jurors of any potential profession because they are in the real world and they don't like falling for BS. So it doesn't surprise me a bit that your friend, the nurse, is the one that took control. But
I love the whole story. And by the way, today, depending on where you went, like you do that south of the Mason-Dixon, you're going to get shot by one of the good guys with the gun in the class. So for all sorts of reasons, it wouldn't happen now.
Yeah. So if the question is, did somebody point a gun at him? If that's the issue, then it doesn't, like all of those details that everybody got wrong doesn't matter because they're being honest. They just recollect different components of it. And sometimes they'll get something completely wrong. You see that a lot with facial hair, interestingly enough. So what you see the defense doing in things like this case is they're going, well, wait a second. There was the woman in the back, and maybe she couldn't see that well with her glasses, but she insists that the man had a bright red cape, and our guy didn't have a bright red cape. So he's entitled, even though his DNA was found, and even though there's a manifesto about how he hated everybody that cut him off in traffic, and like all of these evidence, but wait a second, she insists there was a red cape, so we have to do a new trial here. That's kind of what we're seeing over and over again with cases like this, especially in the modern era, and especially with, I think I'm a huge proponent that kind of the interest in true crime is a good thing. People are getting educated, but there's also there are downsides too. And that is, people kind of believe some of the things that they see that can be very skewed and one-sided, and it's presented. Look, I work for ABC News. I'm a firm believer in the professionalism of a lot of the media organizations that cover true crime when it's done right. But still, it's not presented in the legal context. And another thing to remember, and you know this, Megyn, because you're an attorney. Our law is based on what's called stare decisis, and what that means is we're different than a lot of other legal systems in the world that is Napoleonic or code-based. It's called civil law, where essentially a legislature sits down and they write a rule, okay? Our law is based on common sense, and wise decisions based on real situations involving real people that have withstood the test of time over the years. So when you're talking about the legal application of instructions, those instructions essentially reflect 500 years of wisdom of real people and real human frailty and real misrecollection. And when a jury applies those laws, as they did in the Scott Peterson case, in my experience, 99+% of the time, they get it right.
For those of us holding our breath for the past several months as we came up to this election, we can finally exhale. Work can at last be done on the major issues this country's facing, one of the most significant being our national debt. The fact is, we're broke, and that debt is a house of cards for our nation that cannot be quickly dismantled. So the strategy remains the same. You might want to diversify your savings. This is why I want to tell you about Birch Gold. So many things are out of our control, out of our president's control. So it can be important to have a safe haven for your savings. Birch Gold Group can help you convert an IRA or 401k into an IRA in physical gold. And the best news is it does not cost you 1 cent out of pocket. Text MK to 989898 to get your free info kit. Plus, right now, you will receive a free 1-ounce silver eagle coin for every $5,000 purchased. Protect your savings with Birch Gold. Text MK to 989898 and claim your eligibility for free silver today. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.